Starmer is the anti-Churchill. He's no Churchill. Starmer is far worse than Chamberlain even. In fact, there is no comparison. Starmer is an appalling Prime Minister. I'm Allister Heath, and I'm responding to some of the excellent reader comments on my latest article, As the Liberal Order Dies, Starmer's Britain is Doubling Down on Its Stupidity. We begin this week with a comment from Jean French. And Jean says, Starmer always seems to be on the side of our enemies, internal and abroad, and never for the ordinary people of this country, some of whom voted for him. Good article summarising our wretched downfall. Well, the problem with Starmer is that he has entirely misread the current situation. He's too scared to point out that obviously Iran's Islamist extremist regime is evil and the people trying to overthrow it are good. He has lost his moral compass because he's too scared about the reaction of parts of his base in the UK, or these people who used to be part of his base and who are now voting for the Greens. And his own cabinet and party are rabidly anti-American and against this war. So he's completely and utterly stuck. He is no better than Corbyn, really, when it comes to this issue. On top of that, he has displayed utter incompetence. Now, it's not his fault that the UK armed forces have been drastically and horribly depleted, that we barely have a Royal Navy and barely a functioning defence structure, despite still spending quite a lot of money on defence. That's not Starmer's fault entirely, though of course he's now been in power for a while and should have massively increased defence spending and massively overhauled the way we commission new defence equipment. He's not done that. But the real people to blame here, of course, are the Conservatives, who were in power for 14 years, and New Labour before them, who also decided to spend the Cold War dividend on the welfare state, something that is now clearly a terrible, terrible mistake. So we've gone completely wrong in this country. Starmer himself is useless and incompetent, but I think the rot runs deeper. The next comment is from Hugo McEwen. Whatever you think of this war, and as it happens, I think it's going to be a catastrophe for Europe and Britain. Starmer cares more about his own position and the future of the Labour Party than he does about Britain. Well, I disagree that this war is going to be a catastrophe, unless what you mean by that is it's a catastrophe for us because we have basically been completely sidelined and are not taking part in any way, really. If that's what you mean, I agree, but I suspect you just mean that it's going to be bad, there's going to be deep unintended consequences, the situation may spiral out of control and so on. I hope that that's not going to happen. I'm very, very supportive of this war. Where there's clearly going to be negative side effects, which are inevitable, sadly, is the price of energy, the supply of LNG, that sort of stuff. Clearly, oil prices have already shot up, and there's a reduction in the supply of LNG from Qatar and other countries. There's also big disruptions to trade in the Gulf of Hormuz. But I think, really, that these are actually quite minor problems so far. I think this war is going very well indeed. For America and Israel. I think Iran is being absolutely hammered. Who knows how it will end? Who knows what the end result will be? But so far I'm pretty positive. I think the facts are with me. On the other hand, I absolutely do agree with your point that Starmer cares more about his own position and the future of Labour than Britain. He's been incredibly selfish, incredibly short-sighted here. He's not looking at the national interest or the international interest. He's a supposed human rights lawyer, but he doesn't care about minorities and dissidents being massacred in Iran. He's done far too little to crack down on Iran in Britain. He still hasn't properly got rid of the IRGC in Britain, and so on. And I think that's a scandal. We are a weak country now. We no longer have any geopolitical influence, and it's all going to get worse and worse. The next comment comes from Paul Smith, who says, "What fascinates me is how many people seem to live in a bubble of simplicity. War is bad, peace is good, and let's not get involved." Well, we are involved whether we like it or not. I agree. We live in a post-Cold War bubble, a post-Cold War delusion, which was that all wars are gone, all wars are bad, we can have eternal peace. Eternal peace is actually the natural state of affairs, not war. That's a kind of delusion that we fell into. Many, many people got trapped into that delusion. The difference is that most intelligent people have got rid of the delusion, but some are still stuck in it. And clearly none of this is the case. And some wars are necessary, some wars are just. Not all wars are evil. Obviously, in an ideal world, there'd be no wars. But in practice, some wars are just and some wars need to be fought. And the West needs to have an armed forces that's sufficiently equipped and also ready psychologically to fight when necessary for the protection and survival of our own countries, our own interests, and of Western civilization. And we saw that with Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine's defensive war against Russia is a just war, and many people in the West get that. But what they don't get is that the war against the Iranian Islamist regime is also a just war. This is a very evil regime that obviously wants to obtain nuclear weapons, that has already obtained many missiles and wanted to go further down that road to become immune from any kind of pressure. It's a regime that keeps chanting death to America, death to Britain, death to Israel, and so on. It's a regime committed to anti-Western extremism. So it is good that some countries have decided to fight it, and it's poor that Britain is standing on the sidelines and not actually doing anything meaningful, and it's pathetic that it's going to take us so long even to send a ship to Cyprus. The next comment comes from someone denoting himself as just another. And this person says, "We fell so far so quickly because of two things. Benefits and an easy life. The system was brought in to help people survive until they got a job and earned a salary. Now it gives people a living. A home where the rent is paid for, good tax-free salary so they don't have to work, and soon more money for every child you have. We need to give incentives to work, not incentives not to work." Yes, I agree. What you're basically saying is that Britain has embraced a culture of welfarism, where millions and millions of people of working age who could work don't work because of an overly generous welfare state and a set of traps which basically encourages people, which incentivizes people to work under certain circumstances. And there's no incentive either for the government to do anything about this because they can rely on immigration instead. It's easier to bring in new workers from abroad who are motivated and who want to make money, and it's easier to keep millions of people on welfare. So it's a tragedy all around. And it's also an extremely costly tragedy as the costs keep exploding. And we need the money to spend on other things. We need to cut taxes to boost incentives to work, invest and save. And we need to spend a lot more money on defence. By the way, the answer to defence is not just more money. It's more money and a complete shift in the way we commission new defence equipment and a much more realistic approach towards technology such as drones, that sort of stuff. The next comment comes from B. Cullis, who says, "It's interesting that Starmer continually criticises Trump for having no plan. A bit like the pot calling the kettle black in my view, when it is generally acknowledged that Starmer came into power with no plan." Well, Starmer didn't have a plan, that's true. But I think it's exaggerated to keep demanding a plan. We did not have a plan when in 1939 we were forced to declare war against Nazi Germany. Right? There was no end plan. No one knew how the war would end, how long the war would last, and what the future of Germany and Europe would be, obviously. And that's true of most wars. The idea that you can micromanage everything, that you've got a perfect plan for everything, is wrong. It's a way of just saying you should never do anything. In this particular conflict, of course, the ideal would be some internal revolution which triggers a regime change, and we suddenly end up with an Iran that's much more pro-Western. That might happen, it's not impossible, but it also may not happen. We may end up having a military dictatorship that's much more neutral, for example, towards the West, that sort of thing. Any of that stuff will be much, much better than the status quo. And even if the regime isn't overturned, if we can set back its missile and nuclear plans by a number of years, that will be a great thing. And also if we're able to punish some of these bloodthirsty maniacs who've massacred, tortured and maimed so many innocent people. So yes, obviously people like to talk about plans, but that's really a dead end here, I think. The next point comes from Allister Munro, who says, "Allister, one key point you missed. The EU. The left are desperate to get the UK back into the EU by any means. Further diminishing the UK's role in the world is part of that project. Easier when the UK is a laughingstock with pitiful armed forces and no allies to tell the British people we need the comfort of the EU." Yes, well, obviously, more or less everybody in this government wants to rejoin the EU. They're just too scared to say so. But I think what's quite interesting here is that even the EU, which is actually almost as incompetent or even more incompetent than we are when it comes to defence, is actually performing better than Britain at the moment. There's obviously no reason to rejoin, but it's just a fact. So, for example, the German Chancellor criticised international law, which is very rare for a German leader. He's also rearming much more thoroughly and much more quickly than Britain is. He's much more serious. Even Emmanuel Macron, who talks a lot of nonsense and all this kind of stuff, has just unveiled a new nuclear doctrine which basically entirely negates and goes against the current pacifistic, legalistic worldview that the pro-EU technocrats in Britain are so obsessed with. So there's a lot of change going on in Europe. Yes, you still have places like Spain that are like Britain, but generally speaking, Europe is gradually starting to see sense. The only people who still don't get it are Keir Starmer's government. The next comment comes from Mike Elderton, who says, Starmer is incapable of making a decision, and when decisions are made for him, for all his let me be clear, is incapable of taking action. The state of our armed forces and defence is a national disgrace. More ships are undergoing repair and refitting than are seaworthy. But Trump's lambasting of Starmer in comparison to Chamberlain are inaccurate. Chamberlain was buying time, following the electorate's demands not to enter another war. Starmer is more like Wilson in 1914. Well, I think in this context it's absolutely true that Starmer is the anti-Churchill. He's no Churchill. But Starmer is no Chamberlain either, because for all his faults, for all his misjudgments, for all his naivety, at least Chamberlain massively engaged in rearmament. And it's thanks to that that Britain had a chance by the time Churchill took power. So absolutely right that Starmer is far worse than Chamberlain even. In fact, there is no comparison. Starmer is an appalling Prime Minister. That's all we've got time for today. As always, thank you to all our subscribers for your comments. Keep them coming and we will try and get back to as many of you as possible.